Hi there, my name is John Lustry. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We have a real treat in store for you today. Dr. Gordon Dammann, the founder of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, Antietam National Battlefield Guide, and co-author of Islands of Mercy with John Schiltz, is going to be talking about hospitals in the Maryland campaign of 1862. That's coming up in just a few seconds. I want to quickly say first, again, thank you for watching. If you like our videos, make sure you hit the like button, share, tell your friends, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us wherever you get your social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we're all over the place. So make sure you follow us to stay up to date with all the latest content. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Dr. Dammann here.
Thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk about my favorite place. Well, two favorite places. I'm in my first one, the museum here in Frederick, and then what we do out of the Antietam battlefield. As most people know, Antietam was the bloodiest day in American history. 23,000 killed, missing in action, and wounded. And it was the birthplace, I think, of American military medicine, especially the two people, one Union, Letterman, Jonathan Letterman, and Lafayette Guild, his counterpart with the Confederate Medical Department. And they kind of baptism of fire with the amount of casualties in a 12-hour period. And then as it staged Islands of Mercy, every building, house, barn, school, church, anything that could cover men who were wounded and in bad shape became a hospital. So there were 34 major hospitals for the Union side and probably 15 to 16 on the Confederate side. On the Union side, Jonathan Letterman, who was medical director of the Union Army, he was on scene on the 15th and 16th of September. The battle was the 17th of September, but Jonathan Letterman was on the scene, and immediately from his headquarters at the Pry House, he went out and set up his hospitals. They knew there was going to be a battle here. They knew here from the 15th on, when both armies were within a couple miles of each other, there's going to be a battle. The first big battle was on the 14th up on the South Mountain, and then there was a siege of Harper's Ferry, which was going on at the same period of time. But we're not going to talk too much about Harper's Ferry because there were very few casualties there because it was mostly a siege, and it was over by the 15th. Going back, if it wasn't for Harper's Ferry, we wouldn't be talking about Antietam. We would probably be talking about a battle up around Hagerstown area. When Lee crossed the Potomac River on the 2nd and 3rd of September after his great victory at 2nd Manassas, he decided he couldn't attack Washington, D.C. from the south. There were just too many forts. The Potomac River was a barrier. He didn't want to go back to Shenandoah Valley. He wanted his men to continue. He didn't want them to be idle. And he thought if he could invade northern soil, especially, I think his goal was Pennsylvania. There'll be some historians who'll battle that and say, well, what was his goal? What was his goal? I think he wanted to get into Pennsylvania, fight a battle up in there, and maybe shorten the war or maybe end the war. He could have taken Harrisburg or something like that. So Lee came across the Potomac River down by Leesburg and then came directly here to Frederick. His troops arrived here on the 7th of September 1862. It surprised Lincoln administration. After the great chaos of the Union Army at 2nd Manassas, it was a mess in the Army. And Lincoln had to do something that he didn't want to do, his cabinet didn't want him to do, but he put General George McClellan back in charge of the Union Army. And his goal was to get them in shape and go after General Lee, who was now 50 miles north of him up here in Frederick. So they knew the battle, there was going to be a battle somewhere. Both of them really didn't want to fight at Antietam, especially Lee. Lee wanted to get up around the Beaver Creek line at Hagerstown. but they were kind of drawn into these battles. Most Civil War battles, it's like a magnet. And these people, the armies are just, Gettysburg is the same way. They really didn't want to fight there at Gettysburg either, but they were just drawn there. It's the same thing with Antietam. They didn't want to fight there, but they were drawn there. And then the battle opened on the 17th of September, 1862, at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And then by 6:30 p.m., the battle was over. Both armies looked at each other the night of the 17th and all day of the 18th. They didn't do much after that battle. They're like two prize fighters that went 15 rounds and they just couldn't go anymore. And then Lee finally retreated out of Sharpsburg on the 18th, night of the 18th, and went back into Virginia, which today is West Virginia, Shepherdstown. So the armies were there, and once they leave, what do they leave behind? Wounded soldiers on both sides. And we have to remember this, both medical departments took care of the enemy. Union took care of Confederate wounded, and Confederate officers, medical officers took care of the wounded of the USA. So it was a different kind of war. But the ambulance corps of both army, and this was new to the Union Army, especially under Letterman, who set up the ambulance system, and this was the first time it's going to work big time. So this was the birthplace of the ambulance system and evacuation. Get going. From Frederick to Middletown, the casualties were taken back, especially Union casualties were taken off the battlefield, and they were run through Middletown, Maryland, and then ended up here in Frederick. 30-some hospitals here in Frederick. The first one, hospital number 1, was the Hessian Barracks. These buildings still stand, a part of them still stand at the Maryland School for Deaf right here. And these were put up during the Revolutionary War, and they served as hospital number 1 during the Maryland campaign. The church on the right was the church in Middletown. Letterman had a system. As the wounded were taken off the battlefield, taken to evac hospitals about 2 miles from the battlefield, and then they were going to be evac to Frederick. Now, that's about 17, 18 miles, 20 miles, over rough roads, in ambulances that had springs and water supply. But Letterman decided that the men needed a rest, especially the wounded soldiers. So they pulled in this church here in Middletown and other churches in Middletown, and the wounded men were taken out of the ambulances, taken into the churches or schools or anything else, and then their wounds were redressed. They were given nourishment if they needed water or soups or things like that, just to let them rest for about 6 hours. And then after 6 hours, they placed them back in the ambulance and continued their journey to here in Frederick. So this church played a big role in that. If you go through Middletown, you can't miss it. It's a beautiful white church there in Middletown. Among the wounded treated in Middletown was a future president, Rutherford B. Hayes, served with the 23rd Ohio, and he was wounded on the 14th on South Mountain. His wife, Lucy, came from Ohio to assist in his care, and a lot of wives did this. You'll see some, I'll talk about maybe some other ones that came to administer to their wounded husbands, and many of them did a great job getting them back in shape. Also, the surgeon, Joseph Webb, was a surgeon of the 23rd Ohio who helped Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes survived his wound, and then in 1880 became president of the United States. Brownsville, the church on the left is in Burkittsville, and then this is the Episcopal Church in Brownsville that was General McLaws. McLaws was a Confederate general who came over to the South Mountain at Brownsville Gap and continued on to fight in and around Harper's Ferry. Monday, September 29th. I outlined some of this. Indeed, almost every farmhouse with its outbuilding had been filled. Cedrics Division Hospital within a mile and a half of Keedysville. They were here on Saturday, some 800, all badly injured. They filled not only all the buildings, but were in the barnyards and the hay around in the haystacks. Those who went on to assist was the want of the clothes and provisions. Scores of poor fellows were without shirts or drawers, and many of them were lying out outdoors and covering. There was no covering for them. So, Christian Commission, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Also, the Christian Commission is doing a noble work in sending so many earnest and efficient workers to work in these hospitals. Think of 800 or 900 naked, mangled men, and with not more than a score or so of that and attendants. And many of these were able to do little more than bring water and perform the rudest kind of service. So this talks about the hospitals in and around. Hospitals in Keedysville. The one on the left, the upper left, is an old schoolhouse. It was a seminary, basically for the just church right across the street, the German Reformed Church. And both of these were used as hospitals set up by Jonathan Letterman. In Sharpsburg itself, this church here on the top left was a Lutheran church, and it was badly damaged during the battle. And a lot of people, when I give tours on the battlefield, say, well, why did they shell a church? Well, this church sits on one of the high points of Sharpsburg, and you look up into the steeple. The Confederates were using this as an observation tower. They were directing artillery fire from here. So the Union said, well, if they're using it for that, we'll bombard that church. And it was bombarded heavily during the battle. And it was a church, they used the hospital after, but it was so badly damaged they tore the church down after the armies left, and they moved the church into town. In Shepherdstown, across the river, Shepherdstown, Virginia at that time, this building, the old market house, was also used as a hospital in Shepherdstown. During the Maryland campaign, 20,000 Americans were wounded at various actions. They were treated in more than 150 hospitals from Frederick to Shepherdstown. The hospitals were located in barns, churches, homes, warehouses, and tents. For a while, the wounded outnumbered the civilian population. One thing about hospitals, as both medical directors, the first thing they wanted was a supply of water, so the wounded soldiers could get water, and also to dress their wounds clean. And the second thing was a place to get under shelter, and also now clean straw, so they could be put upon them as sort of a mattress after they were attended to. So the wounded population of Frederick was 8,000, Shepherdstown 1,219, Sharpsburg 900, Boonsboro 864, and they jammed everything was there for hospital sites. This is South Mountain, which was on the 14th. This is the house right on top of Fox's Gap was used as a hospital site. At Shepherdstown, we used a ford. All the bridges were burned out. There were no bridges across the Potomac, so they had to use a ford, and this was Pack Horse Ford, they call that. And the wounded were taken across the river at this ford and then placed in hospitals in the Virginia area. Here's my hero. Everybody has a hero of the Civil War. Either be Abraham Lincoln, I don't take too many McClellan, a hero, Grant, Lee, things like this. But Jonathan Letterman, as combat loomed on the horizon, Jonathan Letterman selected hospital sites east of the Antietam Creek. Like I say, he was there on the 15th, 14th, and 15th, and he was looking for places to take his wounded soldiers. He was appointed surgeon of the Army of the Potomac in July of 1862 by William A. Hammond, who was the Surgeon General of the Union Army. They served together before the Civil War in the western area. Jonathan Letterman ended up in California when the war began, and then came east. And the two of them got together. They were in Wheeling, Virginia, Wheeling, West Virginia. And then Hammond went on to be Surgeon General of the United States, appointed by Lincoln. And then he summoned Jonathan Letterman to come and take over the care of the Army of the Potomac, which was now fighting in and around Richmond at the Peninsula area. He he was a doer. He was a visionary. He saw that there was a need when he got to the Harrisonburg area on the James River, and there were 17,000 wounded Union soldiers from the Peninsula Campaign. Scurvy was a big problem. Typhoid fever was a big problem. The first thing he did with scurvy was summon William A. Hammond in Washington. Send me anything you can hand. Fresh potatoes, fresh meat, any lemons, anything like that to provide vitamin C, which would take care of the scurvy problem. Typhoid came from poor water. So he wanted to get the people his patients out of that area. And he couldn't go north because Lee was blocking his way back to Washington. So what he did, he commandeered river boats. Came down from Washington, down through Chesapeake Bay, turned at Fortress Monroe, came up the James River, and then they started packing these river boats with wounded soldiers, and then carried them back to Washington to the other hospitals. So these, in about 2 weeks' time, he had 17,000 wounded soldiers under some care, and also Confederate soldiers. As we see the criteria, protection from artillery fire from his hospitals, spacious grounds, easy access by ambulances, and good water. So this is what Letterman did, and to me, he's the father of battlefield medicine. This talks about him. He was graduated from Jefferson Medical College in 1849, 1850. He was from Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, which is outside of Pittsburgh. His father was a physician there, and his son, Jonathan, went into the medical profession after he went to school. But he didn't come back to Canonsburg to take over his father's practice. His father had passed away by this time. He decided to become part of the Army Medical Corps. So he, along with 50 others, gathered in New York City. And they had to take a 3-day test, written and oral, in New York City. And there were 50 of them that took it, only 9 passed. And at the same time Letterman took the test, William A. Hammond took the same test. So they were appointed medical officers of the Federal Army. The first duty station for Letterman was down by Tampa, Florida. There he met a lieutenant of artillery down there, a federal lieutenant whose name was Thomas Jackson, who became Stonewall Jackson. So they become pretty good buddies when they were in the hospital in and around Tampa. He went from there to Minnesota, Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, and most of his duty stations were out in the western area, Fort Union, and then, like I say, ended up in California when the war began. But he came back, and quite a man. He was, this is a picture right here, along with his brother officers. This was taken, this was taken around Chancellorsville in 1863. This is Army headquarters at Antietam. This is the Pry House, built in 1844. The Pry family lived there. Mr. Pry and his wife had 6 children. And once the war came close, an adjutant of General McClellan came, knocked on the front door and said, Mr. Pry, the Army's going to take over your house as headquarters for the Army of the Potomac. I would advise you to get your children and your wife and any valuables and get them out of here and go someplace else, maybe 5 or 6 miles away. So this became Army headquarters. It also became medical headquarters. Jonathan Letterman set up his headquarters in this house. The house still stands. It's on the battlefield of Antietam, and it's now part of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We put exhibits in there, and during the summertime, we run tours through there. There's also a barn there that was used as a field hospital, and we conduct tours there and show what Civil War medicine was all about. And we know that President Lincoln came there on October 4th because there was an officer that Lincoln really admired. His name was Richardson, General Richardson, and he was in bad shape. He was up on the 2nd floor, was taken in on the 17th, and he was still surviving in October. His wife was with him and ministering to him, but Lincoln came there on the 4th and had a talk with Richardson. And there's a lot of historians that say if Richardson would have lived, he might have been the next Army commander of the Army of the Potomac. But he succumbed to his wounds on the 7th of November, so he passed away in November. This is a map of the Sharpsburg area. I always hit the wrong button. The town of Sharpsburg is right here. The Antietam Creek flows north to south from Pennsylvania down in here, and then about 6 miles from Sharpsburg, it empties into the Potomac River. It's a beautiful creek. In the summertime, it's full of canoers and kayakers and tubers who come down there and float down the creek. But it separated the Union from the Confederates. The Confederates were on the western bank. In this area here, the Union, as they came into the area, set up there on the eastern bank of the Antietam. And then on the 15th, they were both there looking at each other. On the 16th, they were still looking at each other, especially in the morning, because there was a fog over the whole area. Nobody could really see each other. And McClellan always thought that Lee had close to 100,000, 110,000 men, which he really didn't have at that time. So they looked at each other on the 16th, and the Antietam was a barrier. There were 3 bridges over the Antietam. There's the upper bridge, middle bridge, and then the lower bridge, which today is known as Burnside Bridge. And these bridges are going to play during the battle, especially the upper bridge and the lower bridge. So they looked at each other, and on the 16th, McClellan decided he was going to attack Lee's left flank. So he sent the 1st Corps under General Hooker, followed by the 12th Corps under General Mansfield, up and around, took the upper bridge, and set up on the night of the 16th on the left flank of the Confederate Army. And their job the next day was to attack due south. And their point of attack would be, there was a church called the Dunbar Church. It was whitewashed, didn't look like a church. In fact, some of the Confederate generals thought it was a school. But their attack was the Dunbar Church Plateau. Confederates used the plateau for artillery, and McClellan and Hooker thought that they could take that plateau and place their Confederate their artillery there. They could command the town and cut off Lee's retreat route, which was through the town of Sharpsburg. And then most of the hospitals are designated here by little crosses. The Line Farm, Poffenberger Farm, Hoffman Farm, in Keedysville, all the hospitals there, Locust Spring, Thomas Farm, and down at the Rohrbach Farm. And we'll talk about each one of those. On the other side of Sharpsburg, on the due western side, were the Confederate hospitals. Hunter McGuire was one of the Confederate surgeons. He was a very famous Confederate surgeon. He was personal surgeon to Stonewall Jackson. In fact, he did the amputation of Jackson's arm after Chancellorsville. And he served completely through the Civil War on the Confederate side. Became a very famous doctor after the war. He was one of the first presidents of the American Medical Association. This is the ambulance that carried a lot of the wounded. The ambulances before the Civil War were anything that could convey a wounded soldier. Letterman had these ambulances designed especially to carry wounded soldiers. They were equipped with springs, and they were equipped with water supply, and then inside there was 2 benches, and you could take away wounded soldiers, 8 of them on the benches that they could sit. 2 to 3 could be put in there with stretchers. And he set up this ambulance system, and the people that manned these systems were well trained in how to move the wounded without giving them more problems. So they were trained to pick up the wounded gently and then place them into the ambulance, and then the ambulance would go to the hospitals. This is a picture of Antietam. This is the middle bridge over the Antietam bridge. This bridge does not exist today. It's a modern bridge, but shows the area in and around. This is the western part. This was Confederate. This was the Union over here. And if you go there today, you see many trees. Back then, with not that many trees because the fields were used for crops. But this was the middle bridge that played highly in moving supplies back and forth. Also during the Civil War, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, Christian Commission assisted in the military and the wounded. They contributed food, clothing, along with writing letters and seeking comfort to troops. The Christian Commission was later connected with the YMCA program. And another person that was in this area who did a great job was Clara Barton, who was the founder of the American Red Cross. When the war began, she was getting documents saying that the Union armies needed, especially the hospitals, need extra material, extra underwear, shirts, blankets, things like this for the wounded soldiers. And she went out and got money and then took these supplies to the Union Army hospitals. And the first big battle that she did was at the Battle of Antietam. This is one of the farms still in existence. This is the Locust Spring Farm. This was in existence until Christmas of 1862. As the war was coming, or the battle was ended, all these hospitals were consolidated, and then they brought them back to two big hospitals on the Union side, where the wounded were taken care of for a while, and then moved off into Frederick and other places, Washington D.C., Baltimore, and places like that. But this shows this house is still standing. It's privately owned, but you can visit it. The barn over here was used as a mower. The wounded, or some of them passed away, they put them in here. The bodies were embalmed or buried. This is a surgeon who took care of the wounded. This is Surgeon Oliver of the 21st Massachusetts, and he said he worked completely through the night. And that's why lanterns and candles were important, because they had to work during the night. This is Keedysville again, the Iron Brigade, who were the 4 regiments from the Midwest, 3 from Wisconsin, 1 from Indiana. A lot of them were placed in this hospital and the German Reformed Church in Keedysville. And they talk about this church has been rebuilt. It looks like it today, but it didn't look like that in the Civil War. But as they amputated, which most of the operations were amputation, the legs were thrown out the window and put in a pile and buried in the back. This is the Cedrics Hospital outside of Keedysville, about a mile from Keedysville. And a lot of wounded officers came to this hospital. And one of my favorite ones is Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Was an officer with the 20th Massachusetts. He was wounded in the neck at Antietam. He was brought here, and then he was evacuated to Hagerstown. And then his father came from Massachusetts and rescued his son and took him back to Boston, where he recovered, and then went back in the service. Oliver Wendell Holmes was wounded 3 times in the Civil War. Once in the chest at the Battle of Ball's Bluff here at Antietam, and then in Chancellorsville he was wounded in the foot. And he survived all those wounds, and he lived in the 1930s when he was also Supreme Court Justice. This is a painting that we did called the Islands of Mercy, showing a hospital. It was done by Keith Rocco, and it shows the hospital at the Sam Pry Mill. It was about a mile from the Pry house. There were 2 brothers. The one brother ran the mill. This is Little Antietam Creek. It's in the background. Ran the millstone, but that was used as a field hospital, set up by Jonathan Letterman. We can see him seated on his horse, talking to brother officers as the wounded are brought in by ambulance, taken off the ambulance and then placed in this hospital where amputation were taking place or other type. There were 225 patients. Ambulances coming from the Pry Ford. Little Antietam Creek is on the west side of the mill. Doctors were castigated for getting into the whiskey supply, as happened. An ambulance upset in the creek and bringing the wounded to the hospital. So there was a little bit of chaos getting the wounded there, but due to Jonathan Letterman, he got the chaos out of there and settled down to a working system. This is the Cost Farm, which is right across the road from the Pry Mill Hospital, still in existence, a private residence. A good friend of mine owns this, and we've had some functions inside the house. And in the parlor, or wooden floor, you can still see blood stains on the floor. Now, right after the battle, especially on the Union side, they couldn't get supply quickly enough into the battle area, especially from Frederick, because the bridge over the Monocacy was badly damaged, so they had to use wagons. So right after the battle, the surgeons who were working with the wounded had to make makeshift hospitals. And this is Surgeon Anson Hurd. He was from Indiana, and he used anything he could get to place the wounded under. You can see these are blankets, some stretchers, weapons used to hold these things up. And this is Anson Herder, who was working through this area and waiting. We brought some shelter tents into the area so you could get rid of that other material. I kind of like Anson Herder because I have part of his uniform in my collection, especially his sash. You can see that's Anson Herder in his uniform. Here's his sash, and here's he on the battlefield. We blew up that one picture, and you can see the green sash. Now, green was the color of the medical corps, both sides. You had a green sash, a green shoulder strap. They knew you were part of the medical part. But this was Anson Herder. He survived the Battle of Antietam. He survived a lot of other battles, but he kind of had a nervous breakdown and went back to Indiana and served in Indiana and ended up in Ohio. This is an envelope of the Sanitary Commission, envelope that was given to the soldiers and they could write home. One of the bigger hospitals, the most beautiful hospital, is still in existence, is the Hoffman Farm. The battlefield was over at the other ridge, and they had a trail for ambulances coming from the battlefield down to this hospital. There were over 1,000 soldiers treated here. 2 days ago, a brother guide of mine, Joe, went out and we found the original trail coming from the battlefield to this hospital site. It was on a farmer's field, but this farmer was good enough to let us walk the field and we could see the original trace of the road that was used by the ambulances to come into this hospital. And it's still a beautiful farm today. This is a drawing of the interior of a hospital. You can see amputation table there. You can see the ambulance was bringing the wounded to the barn itself. You can see wounded soldiers probably waiting to be attended to, or they've been attended to and they're waiting to be evacuated out of there. But this is kind of a stylistic drawing showing the amputation going on, a surgeon, assistant surgeon. They worked in teams of 3. The head surgeon, assistant, and the one who administered anesthetic. Biggest misconception I had when I talked to lay people about the Civil War, I say, how many think that they used anesthesia during the Civil War? Most of them raise their hand. But anesthesia was used during the Civil War quite effectively by both armies. Probably 98% of the amputation or operations were done with anesthesia, and the 2 of them were chloroform and ether developed in the 1840s. So if you learn nothing else from this little part, remember there was anesthesia during the Civil War. And another thing, they didn't bite bullets. Bite the bullet if you have pain. Well, most of the bullets I saw, they have teeth marks in it, but they come from the pigs. The pigs are roaming the battlefield and they gnaw on anything. But there was no human indentation in these bullets. Now, I was a dentist for 40-some years and I know what teeth marks look like. So if you hear the term bite the bullet, forget about it. During the casualties in the Westwoods, there were 2 brothers, Edward and Paul Revere, both relatives of the Revere of the Revolutionary War. Paul was a line officer. His brother was the surgeon of the 20th Massachusetts. And they were both wounded. Paul was wounded, and his brother Edward was wounded on the battlefield, but he didn't survive. He was killed instantly on the battlefield administering to patients. So the 2 Revere brothers were wounded there at the Battle of Antietam in the West Woods. Another hospital that was used is called the U.S. Hospital at Smoketown. This is around where the Hoffman Farm was and the Smoketown Road. Now, Smoketown was a little settlement north of the battlefield. It was called Smoketown because there were 3 blacksmith shops there who emitted a lot of smoke during their work. So, and this was a special road, the Smoketown Road, that brought the wounded out by ambulance. It was in a grove of trees. There was only 2 buildings there, but there were a lot of trees. And these are the tents that were brought in, and the men would put it in these tents to get under some kind of protection from the elements. This hospital existed until the spring of 1863. Brother Guy and I, Paul, working to find the exact place of this. A lot of people say, well, it was here, and here. We still don't know exactly where this hospital was, but we're trying to get to a place where there are a lot of big oak trees, and we're trying to measure these trees to see if they could have been around 100 and some years ago. So that's one of our goals, is to find out where the actual Smoketown Hospital was. This shows the care of the wounded. You can see the tents. This is a very famous woman. She was the angel of the battlefield at Smoketown. They're moving wounded into the tent area in and around. And there she is again. The lady in the center is Maria Hall. Second Clara Barton. Mrs. Hall was at Smoketown from September to mid-May and did great service to the wounded soldiers there. You can see the cots. These big hospital tents could probably hold 15 to 20 in each tent. So they put them together back and back, and they could make like little corridors and wards out of each one of these. But the trees provided some kind of a coolant area, and they had to have a water supply. And that's what we're looking for. If we find a hospital site, there has to be a water supply to supply this hospital. We're back to the Eating Farm. And here's Clara Barton, the daughter of Judge Barton. She arrived at the Well, she was at the Sam Poffenberger farm. She was almost killed there. And Dr. Dunn said she was the angel of the battlefield. Later, Lincoln named her to the Missing Soldiers Bureau, and she founded the American Red Cross. Now, she came in when the war started. She was working at the U.S. Patent Office in downtown Washington. She was trained as a teacher, but she didn't really like that, so her friends got her a job in Washington. And this is unbelievable, a woman working in an office building in Washington, D.C. But she was there, and like I said before, she got word that the wounded needed extra care. So she got the money together and brought out extra material to the wounded in the hospital. She did this completely through the war. When the war ended in 1865, she set up an office building in downtown Washington, the Missing Soldiers Bureau, which is also part of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine complex. And people would write to her and her people that are working for her, asking where their husband was killed, which hospital he was in, do you know where he's buried, and things like this. And then for 3 years, till 1868, she answered each one of these inquiries. 1868, she had a nervous breakdown. I can see why, serving completely through the Civil War and then doing all this until 1868. She went across the Atlantic and ended up in Switzerland. When she went to Switzerland, she was recovering from her mental problems, and she saw what they had over there is called a Red Cross. The Red Cross were doing philanthropic type things, taking care of sick people, disasters and things like this. So she got the idea, she got her mental health back and came back to the United States, and she said, well, we can do that here. So that's what she set up the American Red Cross she did when she came back. She lived in 1906 when she passed away. And she was quite a lady. She was not a nurse technically in the beginning of the war. She was appointed a nurse later on. But amazingly, she was a person who went out and did good things for the hospitals. This is her monument there at Antietam. It's a stone, granite piece of stone, has a plaque on it. And also you can see down at the bottom, there's a red cross made out of bricks. And these bricks came from her house in Massachusetts where she was born. This is another view of the hospital where she worked out of. This is the hospital of the 12th Corps. This is the Michael Farm, the 6th Corps hospital there. They're both pretty much close to each other. There's the Dunbar Church. Stood there, was built in the 1850s, early 1853. Survived the Civil War. You can see he took some shelling there because it was pretty much right in the middle of the battlefield. You can see a dead horse here to the right. Survived the battle. Survived until 1921 when a hellacious windstorm came and blew it down. Townspeople came out and tried to collect most of the parts of the church that were still available, put them in their barns. And then 1960-61 centennial was started American Civil War. The church was rebuilt on its original foundation. But it doesn't look like a church. It looks like a schoolhouse. The people, the church goers didn't want a steeple. They didn't want stained glass windows. They didn't want to be presumptuous and put things like this. And their church service was very simple. On Sunday, the parishioners would come to the church, the ladies and the children on one side, the men on the other side. There would be 3 elders of the church, and they would open the Bible. The Bible still was on display at the Visitor Center at Antietam, and they would read passages from the Bible, discuss that for about an hour and a half, and then they would break up, and then they would go to the parishioner's house for a meal commemorating the Last Supper. The road goes right across the Hagerstown Pike. This is the main pike that was used by both armies, mainly the Southern Army, to move men and material. So this was quite important, and you can see how it stands out. It was white. You can see the woods behind it. That is the west woods behind the church. This is again downtown Sharpsburg with the badly damaged Lutheran church. This is the German Reformed Church now on Main Street in Sharpsburg. The 16th Connecticut was the regiment at the last part of the battle. They used this as their hospital in town, and the church wasn't badly damaged. The pipers and the roarbox were all attended there, and their stained glass window, you can see on the left, is very military. A few years ago, the window needed to be repaired and stuff, and there were parts of the veterans units in Connecticut had brought the money to restore the windows in the church. The church still stands today. This is downtown Sharpsburg. As I looked at that time, you can see an Episcopal church over on way in the background that was also used as a field hospital. This is the Rohrbach Farm. This is outside, not too far from the Burnside Bridge. And a lot of wounded Union were brought back. In fact, 2 wounded generals were there. General Rodman, who was wounded at the last charge, and then Colonel Kingsbury, wounded on the bridge itself, and they were brought and they died here in the barn itself. This was the Rohrbach, and it's still standing today. Now this is a very famous building. It was a Confederate hospital. It's on the other side of Sharpsburg. It's halfway between there and the Potomac River. The Confederates were using this large house as a hospital. You can see it was also used as a signal tower. If you look up on the top, you can see signal flags. I say they didn't have telegraph at this time, so they signaled by wigwagging flags. The house was overrun as the Confederates moved off and went back to Virginia. The Union took it over as a hospital. They let the Confederate surgeons still work on their wounded there. And this house became very famous because when Lincoln came here came to the area in October, he came and wanted to visit a hospital. So he came here and asked the surgeon, who was Jonathan Letterman, to take him to the hospital. And there's a famous picture of he and McClellan and brother officers, which you'll see in a minute. This is the wounded were taken across the river, the Confederate wounded, to Shepherdstown. This is Shepherd University today, and this was a building that was used as a hospital in Shepherdstown. Other hospitals in Shepherdstown, Presbyterian Church, and the Mulder housed the wounded Confederates. Now that's a picture that was taken of the Grove Farm, which you saw the drawing of, and you can see there's the house, and this big large tent was a tent for the general quarter, and here's Lincoln here, and you can see that the staff officers, there's McClellan, and all the staff officers were brought over to meet with the president, and they all kind of buttoned themselves up looking good because the commander-in-chief was there. This little guy, he's always trying to get into the picture. That's that's a Captain Custer, who became very famous in 1876 with the Sioux Indians. But he was always trying to get into the picture close to the president himself. And you see other pictures, he's wandering from here, he's over here and here. Now this is Jonathan Letterman. He's real close to the president. Once the president had the picture taken, had a talk with McClellan and the other officers, the president came to Letterman and said, "Would you take me to a hospital?" There was the only barn in the hospital. And Letterman said, "Yes, sir, anything you need." So he took him in the hospital, and the president said, "I'd like to meet some Confederate wounded." So they found a young Confederate lad, probably 17 years old, He was laying on a pallet, and the medical officer says he's probably not going to live too much longer. He'd been there for a couple of weeks now. And the president knelt down next to this man, took off his hat, and they had about a 5-minute conversation. Nobody could hear what they said to each other. When the conversation was over, Lincoln got back up to a 6'4" frame, and kind of you can see how he towered over everybody else. And Letterman noticed tears coming down the president's face. And all the president could say, when will this war ever end? When will it ever end? And this is 1862, and it's going to go on from 62 to 63 to 64, and finally in 65 it's going to end. But this is a very famous picture of the president and the brother officers. There's a drawing of a blow-up of it. You can see Letterman. He really didn't want to be there. He wanted to be in the hospital working, so he's kind of standing around. Oh, let's get this over, get this picture over with, and then we can do other things. And that kind of tells you about the hospitals in and around the area. There's still work going on. John Schultz and I are working. We finished this book that we did, and it came out in October, November of this last year. And we're trying to do more things with it, trying to figure out where the hospital was, like the Smoketown Hospital, and do more research into the hospitals, because they're very important. So I hope you learned from our discussion this morning, whenever we show it, this morning, this evening, whenever, but it was a pleasure to come out and talk to you about our hospitals at Antietam. Thank you.